days of more channels and less money, where does the CBC fit in? Hello. In the beginning, the idea was that the CBC would help Canadians define themselves. Now, 60 years later, it's the CBC that may need defining. Cuts of hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of jobs mean the public broadcaster has to change. It will affect what we do and what you see. But what kind of change? There's no agreement on that among the CBC, the public, or the politicians. Tonight, in this documentary with Carol Off, we look at those issues of money, mission, and mixed signals.
Years before television would take over our lives, Conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett was already trying to gain control of the airwaves.
And now here comes that 20th century Columbus, Ed Wynn!
Trying to stop Canada from being flooded with American radio programs.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
The government wanted broadcasting in Canada to be a tool of nation building, nothing less than the core of our identity as a country.
Here's more copy, Mr. Green.
Lauren, would you give us a level, please?
1, 2, 3, 4. This is the CBC. Okay?
But by the time the magic flicker of TV came over the border, we'd already lost the war. Not to U.S. broadcast signals, but to Canadian ones. The government couldn't resist licensing private broadcasting as well.
Score. New York Rangers, nothing. Toronto Maple Leafs, nothing.
7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time on election night, 1957.
The CBC was invented to put on Canadian programs. The private system was invented to make Canadian money, mainly by rebroadcasting American shows. The CBC did too in order to compete, so while Canada got Don Messer's Jubilee, it also got more U.S. programs. Broadcasting in Canada quickly lost its way. Library shelves sag under the weight of reports written over those decades trying to fix broadcasting in this country. All of them call for more money, for the CBC to do more, to be all things to all people. Well, on the eve of the multi-channel universe in both radio and TV, the government's saying we can't throw money at our identity struggle anymore. So it's time to start winning some battles instead of losing the war.
I believe the CBC is as central to the life of this country in 95 as it was in 35, 55, or when we did our report in 85. No question about it. Can't imagine us being without it. But it has to be the right CBC.
Jerry Kaplan was co-author of the 1986 Kaplan-Sauvageau Task Force on Broadcasting, one of the many efforts to fix the corporation. Kaplan freely admits his report was the end of the era.
I fear that we can't any longer afford the luxury of the kind of CBC that we are probably, my commission was probably the last in the world ever to be able to recommend. Politically, we argued, unless the CBC offered something to all Canadians, it wouldn't have the political support to get the funding it needs. I now think we haven't got the funding to be able to afford that kind of CBC.
Our sole reason for being is to serve our audiences.
The $227 million cut announced by Parambiti today is the largest in CBC history. In fact, it's a larger single dose than all the cuts in the past decade put together. According to CBC Chairman Ghislaine Saucier, it isn't over yet.
In fact, the government indicated to us a few months ago that we might have to go to $350 million overall. But this is not confirmed yet. But we have to be realistic. The government is facing a major deficit crisis itself. So I'm expecting that we will have another round of cuts.
You are anticipating that?
Yes.
What will you do? What will the board do?
If we do have to go further than $225 million that we already announced, this is very clear for me that we will have to affect programming and services.
But a lot of people wonder how the CBC can make even today's cuts without affecting what goes on the air. Former CBC President Tony Manera resigned in protest to cuts just last spring.
I find that difficult to believe that $227 million can be cut without affecting programming. Certainly when I was there, my colleagues and I looked at the finances very, very carefully. And we did come up with a plan that could cut around $120 million, but that was based on a number of assumptions. I doubt that those assumptions still hold, and therefore I even doubt that $120 million could be cut without some impact on programming.
No matter where you draw the line at what affects programs, the CBC has a lot on its plate. It runs 6 radio and TV networks, plus 2 all-news services, everything in French and English, transmitted over 5 time zones. It has regional news and national news. It broadcasts in native languages in the north and foreign languages around the world. Something's got to give.
Mr. Speaker, in Edmonton, the CBC French station there has an average audience of 300 people.
The Reform Party has an answer. Privatize the CBC, or at least parts of it. Reform turns to the model of public broadcasting in the United States, where PBS buys most material for broadcast and has only a few shows in-house, like the former McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. But Robert McNeil says even the much-reduced American model may lose its federal funding.
There are politicians in the States, notably among the Republican majority in the Congress, who would like to do that to public broadcasting. Some, at one extreme, would like to eliminate any federal funding for public broadcasting and see it all privatized and make its way in the world in competition.
Robert McNeil grew up in eastern Canada and returns to Canada routinely. He remembers early broadcasting in this country.
Even though, as a child, before the television age, we consumed large amounts of American radio. I mean, I spent a lot of my childhood listening to the Green Hornet and the Lone Ranger and all kinds of stuff that was American. Nevertheless, there was enough Canadian broadcasting around that I never had any doubt about my identity as a Canadian.
McNeil says CBC still has that effect on him, but only in part.
I've always thought that I don't really feel I'm back in Canada until I can listen to Peter Zosky for a while, because it seems, listening to him, that you're breathing Canadian air again. Whereas the story on television is obviously mixed.
Canadians have been enjoying a love affair with English radio, primarily since the so-called CBC radio revolution of the 1970s, when it dropped advertising and focused exclusively on homespun original material.
There is nothing in the United States that ties Americans together the way CBC radio ties Canadians together. And that's exactly the role that English Canadian television should play, I think can play, and I guess I'd go further and say must play. Go back to the basic principles. We desperately need English Canadian CBC television. But we better get it right, because otherwise it's not going to exist at all.
But the CBC makes a lot of money selling ads on TV, and so it needs shows that bring in high ratings. For Liberal MP and former CBC broadcaster John Harver, that's the problem.
Look, CBC English television is different from its commercial brothers and sisters, if I can put it that way. But it's not different enough.
As chairman of the Commons Heritage Committee, Harvard may have a big job ahead, helping to redefine the CBC.
We've allowed the CBC to drift. And to be fair to the CBC and its employees, and to be fair to this country, we've got to put a stop to that drift. Now, that doesn't suggest for a moment that if we were to somehow change the mandate, that it's going to go over very well. Because, look, we've got some very hardcore supporters of the CBC, perhaps even me, who would object to certain changes.
Does your government have the political will to make the kind of changes necessary, to make the hard choices necessary for the CBC?
I hope. Well, as I say, it's part and parcel of addressing the debt and deficit. If we can't divide it, we just can't. It would be irresponsible on our part to somehow just allow Mr. Martin to go ahead, as he should, and address our financial problems without dealing with some of these ramifications, like the impacts on the CBC. So we've got to do the whole thing.
The whole thing includes a complete mandate review led by former CBC President Pierre Junot.
I think the CBC has been studied to death over the last number of years, I would hope that Mr. Juneau would be able to give us some kind of a roadmap, because there are difficult choices to make.
I mean, the choices for the CBC are very, very tough. Somebody's bull is going to get gored. Many people are going to get hurt. We either are going to lose regional programming, or we're going to lose local programming, or we're going to lose central programming. And I think people shouldn't have any illusion about it. And whichever of those options happens, it's not going to be nice for a large number of people and for the whole CBC. No one wants to be responsible for that unless they absolutely have to. Now they have to.
Some of the obstacles for changing the CBC have less to do with vision and more to do with negotiations. Management expects to make up $35 million of the cuts through new labor contracts.
Our employees, our unions, will understand, as I think everybody does right now, that CBC has to go through that change to survive. We have to be more flexible to compete. If we're not able to do that, how do you think that we will be able to be there in 5 years?
If it resulted in labor problems, a strike or a lockout, what kind of sympathy would we have with the public with a serious labor action?
Damn little, mainly because I think that there's a feeling out there that all Canadians have been traumatized by this disruption in the economy the last 5 to 10 years. So if there are complaints from CBC employees, I think it'll be taken as whining.
What is survival for? What is the great fight to remain on the air for? Is it to be just another broadcaster and keep a lot of people employed, or is it to do something that is distinctive and worthy in itself? And that, I think, probably applies to the CBC as much as it does to PBS in the States.
Much of the CBC's history is in this museum in the Toronto Broadcasting Centre. There's a real desire to make sure the CBC's future doesn't become a museum exhibit as well. So some hard decisions have to be made now to determine what kind of CBC Canada needs and what it can afford.